We're coming now to a very important chapter, the resurrection of Lazarus. Its importance cannot be overstressed for one simple reason. It is a description of the inner experience that every person on earth is destined to go through. It makes no difference where you are in consciousness now. It makes no difference if you have accepted the divine will within yourself or not. It makes no difference how high you go or how low you go. The resurrection of Lazarus must take place in your consciousness. A very strange thing happens when you look at this particular experience. It almost explains by itself the reason that mankind has lost sight of the meanings of the Bible. And if we number ourselves among those who have caught some measure of truth in the Bible, we are definitely among the minority. You will look through the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospel of Luke, and you will not find the resurrection of Lazarus. And when you begin to question that, to wonder why, you may come to the conclusion that they simply did not know it had happened. When it occurred, they were not at the level of awareness that could discern this inner experience. John could. That's why John was designated the heir apparent on earth to the Master. The one who was the witness of this supreme demonstration was John. And Peter, in dictating his experiences to Mark, simply did not tell him about the resurrection of Lazarus. Luke was unaware of it. Matthew, dictating to Levi, seems to have no awareness of it. And so there it appears alone in the Gospel of John. And that leads to a second question. Was it a visible event? If everybody was there and Lazarus came out of a tomb, how could they possibly leave it out of their Gospels? By what earthly purpose could they omit the resurrection of Lazarus and yet talk about the raising of a girl from a coma or the healing of a cripple or a blind man? Was this not the supreme demonstration? And does it not indicate that the supreme demonstration is not a visible one, but rather an inner transformation, not visible to human eyes, not even to the eyes of the disciples of Jesus Christ? For they had not yet reached the level of resurrection. The witness was John. When this first came to me, that this had to be an inner event, I couldn't accept it. I could believe it might be, but I couldn't accept it as a full-blown positive truth. I had to have evidence too. And the evidence came degree by degree. And when you started looking for evidence that this was an inner event, that's when you began to perceive the evidence. So I went through many of the manuals, many of the encyclopediae, many of the great writers on the Bible, and you know, I couldn't find one who would mention that the resurrection of Lazarus was not in the three Gospels. Let alone discuss it, they wouldn't mention it. And as a result, the commentators on the Bible, bypassing this, have never really peeked under the inner meaning of it, because they have accepted it as the resurrection of a man called Lazarus, who stepped out of a tomb because Jesus Christ stood there and said, "Lazarus, come forth." That isn't what happened at all. In the outer world, it's very likely that Lazarus was sick and he recovered and that was it. And it didn't mean very much for that reason. On the inner planes of consciousness where John lived, the resurrection of Lazarus took place. And so he alone could put it in his Bible because he alone could discern the activity. He alone could bring us the meaning of Christ being born in the consciousness of an individual. And so when he wrote the Gospel of John, including the resurrection of Lazarus, as you begin to see these names come by, Martha, Mary, Bethany, Lazarus, Jews, you begin to see them more as symbols than as people. In the outer, yes, they appear as people to us, but in the inner, they are qualities. And the closer you look at these qualities, the more you realize that John has been able to give us a mystical code which connects the various phases of inner development that are necessary for each of us to go through the inner resurrection. He connects them up in such a superhuman way that we see the skill of a surgeon at work. Now then, let's try to remember that if, let's say, President Nixon were assassinated today, and let's say there were 4 papers in town, if 20 years from now we look back at these 4 papers, it would be amazing to find that one of them did not print that President Nixon had been assassinated. How in the world could they not print it? That's the purpose of being a newspaper. If you look back at the time of the Kennedy's assassination or the Luther King assassination, you'll find every paper had a record of it. And then if Lazarus came forth out of a tomb, witnessed by so many people, how could the Gospels not have a record of it? You see, it had to be an invisible event, and that's why there's no record of it except in John's Gospel. You will recall the Master keeps saying, "I am going to leave you, but my hour has not yet come. My hour has not yet come." What was he waiting for? You'll find he was waiting for the resurrection of Lazarus. That's the signal of his hour. The supreme demonstration of the non-reality of death is the beginning of the hour, because immediately following this, and this is why John's Gospel is so important to us, immediately following the resurrection is the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, the higher consciousness. He had to wait for resurrection before proceeding into the higher consciousness which leads to ascension. This is a key landmark in the spiritual journey, missed by most of the Christian world. It is really the beginning of the Christian mysteries. It is not only the revelation of the non-reality of death, it is exposing death as a counterfeit of a different kind of death, that there are two kinds of death. The one death in which you die but are not extinct and come back in another form, and the second death in which you die to death, in which you die to the false sense of self and are resurrected unto life while in the flesh. And this complete resurrection experience is not an after-death experience, going to another place. It's the other side of the coin of dying to the false sense of self. On the other side of the coin, as we die to the false sense of mortality, we are reborn to the true sense of self. And so simultaneously, dying to self and being born to self are taking place. He's teaching us the necessity of dying to self and showing us the depth of dying that is necessary to be born to self. And further, assuring us that this is the way. Now we have to follow this with the eye of spirit. We have to understand it, and if we don't, we have to do it again. We have to understand it so well that the impression is made upon us that our function on this earth is to die to death, and to die to the conditions that cause death, and to die to them while we are in the flesh, through an understanding of their nothingness, until we can feel the birth, the resurrection of living spirit as our own selfhood, until we can step out of the grave of false mortality. Now, if you think this was a visible event, even though it wasn't in the other three Gospels, you miss the point and you think Jesus raised Lazarus. When you know it's an invisible event, you realize that Lazarus is mankind. This is the resurrection of mankind, seen through the eye of the enlightened John. You already are going through this resurrection. As personal self dies away, as spiritual selfhood expresses itself where you stand in your activities, you are experiencing this resurrection. The culmination of this experience is the Lazarus experience. And it's all in the flesh. It's on this side of the veil. Resurrection never takes place after death. It takes place before death, and it is an invisible spiritual process in which the old man dies. Now remember, it's chapter 11, after the divine power on earth of the Spirit has been revealed in many ways, and directly preceding the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where the greater works will be done. Without this step, there would be no triumphal entry into ascension, the new Jerusalem or higher consciousness. Now a certain man was sick, named Lazarus, of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. This activity of wiping the feet of the master with her hair and anointing himself with ointment, this was an activity later in the Bible not at this point. But John wants us to know this is the Mary who later will do these things. And therefore his sister sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. Now let's catch the mystical code here. A certain man was sick, named Lazarus. We're going to find a very ingenious device worked here by Spirit. Lazarus is sick. And Lazarus is going to be buried before the Master comes. And so we'd have no way of knowing what's going on in the consciousness of the one called Lazarus. And that's why Mary and Martha remain above board, visible in this delineation. They are the consciousness of Lazarus. They are what's taking place in Lazarus for Lazarus to come forth. We trace his consciousness through Mary and Martha. That's the device used here by the Spirit. And so while Lazarus is interred, you're going to find a code about what Mary and Martha do, explaining what took place in Lazarus to enable him to reach this high development, and what is going to have to take place in him to bring him forth again. And of course, they're talking all the time about the Lazarus in you. For Lazarus in you is that state of development which is ready through purification to be Christed. When you reach the moment in which you're ready to be Christed, that is Lazarus. And that comes through the various mystical codes that John is going to carefully trace for us. He says that they were in Bethany. Bethany, you'll discover, is a state of consciousness through which your soul must travel. It is a city where the division of yourself is united into one. And that Bethany, at the moment, is pointed out to be the town of Mary and Martha. They are two. And they must be united into one in Bethany. That's where the union takes place. That's where Christ is born in Lazarus. That's where you present yourself in your uplifted consciousness of one to be Christed by the Spirit. And as you pass through Bethany, you're on your way to the higher consciousness called New Jerusalem. These are not places, they are symbols. This isn't just Bethany, it's the town of Mary and Martha, meaning this is the consciousness that Mary and Martha will come into. Now we're going to see why Mary and Martha are so different. It was that Mary, which it should say later, and that's what it means. Oh, there it is. It's in parentheses, and that means it's just a footnote to explain who this Mary is. It was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with a hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore his sisters sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. Now they had to write to him. And this is a situation that occurs in our normal mortal experience. We may be disciples of the Christ, as Mary and Martha were, but in a moment of stress, we are separated from Christ. And this is why he was not there at the time. In this moment of tribulation, they were separated from Christ in their own consciousness. And so they had to fill this gap of space, this gap of time, with a letter. They had to write, and this is significant of the separation between them. If Mary and if Martha were in the awareness of the presence of Christ, there would be no writing, and we would not understand the nature of the absence of Christ causing the sense of grief, the sense of doubt, the sense of worry. always in the absence of Christ in your consciousness, through some particular kind of tribulation, we overlook that which is the answer to our problem. Not a letter sent to Christ, the awareness of the presence of Christ where I stand. This would have been their solution, and we are being forewarned not to make the same error. It's all by way of symbolically showing us that the absence of Christ is the problem. The presence of Christ will be the solution. And all of this is what's taking place not only in Mary and Martha, but Lazarus has gone through these stages in order to be where he is, at that point of receiving the birth of Christ within himself. He has united Mary and Martha within his own consciousness, as we all must do. Therefore, after they had sent a letter, when Jesus heard that Lazarus, whom he loveth, was sick, and that word love means he knows him. In spiritual terminology, when you love, you know that individual, you know his identity. And so they carefully phrased it to show that Jesus knew the identity of Lazarus. He whom you loveth. When you say, I love you, the spiritual knowledge that should accompany that is, I know who you are. I know your name. I know your identity. I know your spiritual selfhood. And that I love. This was the relationship between Christ Jesus and Christ Lazarus, knowing the identity of the other. Now you'll see then that Lazarus is higher than the disciples. The 12 disciples represent qualities, human qualities. Lazarus has passed the human qualities. Lazarus is coming into spiritual rebirth. The disciples have not yet done that. And so in order to teach the disciples, there must be one who can advance beyond them, and there must be one who can witness that advance. And that's the value of Lazarus and John the Witness. All this is being done by Spirit for the purpose of enlightening all who are disciples of the Christ, all who in their humanhood are turning to the higher spiritual self. Jesus says, this sickness is not unto death, but that the glory of God, the Son of God, might be glorified thereby. Now these beautiful words, this sickness is not unto death, has many meanings for us. This is the revelation then. We know he's going to die as humans die, but it is not unto death. It is not going to be that kind of death which is extinction. It's not a permanent death. Then what kind of death is it? It's a death within a man, a death of a false sense of self, which outwardly appears, in this case, to be death, but it's dying to that which never was death. This is called righteous death. It's a new death, a second kind of death, and it's revealing that human death is a counterfeit. It's a counterfeit of the right kind of death. The right kind of death is one in which you die without dying. Death without dying is the true death, because it's rather a transformation of consciousness within. The old consciousness dies, that's all. The new consciousness lives and will come forth out of the tomb of the old consciousness. And this is a phase of preparation at a high level for the phase of ascension. Now this point, if you could visualize yourself as Lazarus, you would be going through a death that is not dying, but the qualities of mind and body that you have known, the concepts you have experienced, the life you had lived, would be dying out of your consciousness to make way for a new kind of life, a new kind of consciousness. And this is what is called, this is not unto death. It only appears to be death, but it isn't. It's a changeover, a change of consciousness, but a complete change, not a patch, not just a temporary emptying out. It's a complete and total changeover. And you're going to find it's even a changeover in body, in mind. It's the way to the soul and the soul universe. This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. In the death of the old consciousness, the Son of God is glorified. He had said so to the blind man when the disciples said, "Who has sinned, this man or his father or his parents?" Neither. This is that the glory of God may be made manifest. And so here, the apparent dying is to make known the nature of the true life. For the glory of God. And so as Lazarus in you, the old man, the consciousness through which you have lived a mortal life up to a certain point, is finally put to rest, the Son of God in you is made manifest, but not before. You can't hold on to Lazarus and be a witness to the Son of God in you. There must be an inner dying of the old man for a birth of the new. You can't straddle the fence. And that's why it's such a total here. That's why he's put in a tomb. That's why he's buried. You see, up to now, all resurrections in the Bible have been, at least in the New Testament, he would raise a girl from asleep who was in a coma, but she wasn't buried. She was in a bed. And then he'd get around to the boy in the coffin in the city of Nain, but he wasn't buried yet. He was on his way to be buried. He was in a coffin. They were resurrections, but not of one who had been buried. You see the degrees, the progressions of dying to the old self. This is the total death of the old self. That's why he's buried in a tomb. He's not just dead, he's dead and buried. And the old self must be dead and buried. You have no choice. If you make the choice, it's because you're not letting yourself move in the divine will, which says there is no choice, this is the way. The old self must be dead and buried for the new self to rise. Matter is dying that spirit may reveal itself as the only life. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And when he had heard, therefore, that he was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. There's a key word there, and if you have a Bible or 5 Bibles, look at them. Look at them in the 6th verse of the 11th chapter of John. John 11, verse 6. And you may find that if it isn't the King James, it won't read exactly as this does. And the reason is because many of our translators, in order to simplify the Bible, to change its grammar, to make it conform to modern usage, have done inadvertently a very sad thing. Now, for example, here, he abode 2 days still in the same place. That's very bad grammar, I will admit that. And so if you look in your Bible, you may find that he remained in that city for 2 days, or some other changing of the words. But you will very rarely find one Bible translator who uses the word still, because he's got to clean up the grammar of the Bible. And that's the key word that they cut out. He abode 2 days still in that city. It doesn't mean he remained in another city and for 2 days. It means that for 2 solid days he was still in communion with the Father. It's describing the state of his consciousness in which he remained in total communion with the Spirit of God within himself, with the Spirit of God within Lazarus. He was raising the dead. He was raising that which was not dead, but which seemed to be. On the inner plane of consciousness, Lazarus and Christ Jesus were one. He abode 2 days still. You look it up, 11:6, and you find the word still in most Bibles has been removed because the translator was totally unaware of its meaning. He would have called this what the grammarian calls redundant. If he remained there, why say he remained there still? He remained there. But the word still didn't refer to his physical immobility. It referred to his inner stillness. And you know, most of us, having read this, probably never saw the word still. It's quite a shock suddenly to see it there. I didn't know it was there. Still, still, still. Why, that's the message of the Bible. Be ye still and know that I am God. And here's Jesus Christ being still for 2 days after receiving this letter. It's going to become very significant as we move along here. Then after that saith he to his disciples, let us go unto Judea again. After that 2-day stillness. Judea, why, he just came out of there. They tried to stone him. Let us go unto Judea again. Yes, because going unto Judea again was now a symbol that when he was there before, the consciousness was in a state of two-ness. But now, after this long stillness, the consciousness in Judea was ready to yield to oneness. And so we can return to Judea now. While he is in this state of stillness, not only is Lazarus receiving the Christ impulse, but even Martha and Mary are receiving the Christ impulse, and those two are becoming one on the outer. Divine power is released in this 2-day stillness, this turning away from world thought, breaking the link of world thought with the consciousness of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, liberating them into Christ. Now, as you dwell with this, you'll discover this is a very important key to the healing consciousness. There's no visible connection between Lazarus and Jesus Christ and Martha and Mary, but in the stillness they are all one. There's no space between them or time between them, and there's no corporeality. They're a spiritual one self. The seeds of the so-called resurrection have been sown in the stillness. His disciples said unto him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee, and goest thou thither again? This is the consciousness of the disciples. They have a man called Jesus in their midst, whom they love, whom they respect, whom they try to emulate, but they do not know him. No matter what they have seen him accomplish up to now, they still are feared for his personal safety. How can he go back where they try to stone him? Won't they still be hostile? And Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of this world. Now the day has 12 hours. Later you've discovered that 12 is the symbol of total Christhood attained. In other words, 12 signifies I, the Spirit of God. Self-completion in Christ, 12 hours. He had 12 disciples. These 12 would all be Christed. The human qualities would be divined, so that normal human love would become divine love. All human qualities would be absorbed into the higher divine, or they would die to be reborn in the divine. And I, Jesus Christ, am that divine. The 12 qualities of Jesus Christ are already I divine. And does the I walk in fear? Does Christ in you need protection? Only those who have not accepted Christ within. For I walk in the day. The day is the Spirit. The night is the darkness of materiality. The day is the immortal self. The night is the mortal sense of self. And so we find Lazarus buried in a cave, out of the day, in the night, in the darkness, because darkness is dying that day may dawn. 12 symbolizes I, the complete self. And the complete self realized walks in fear of no man and no condition. Therefore, whoever has not accepted I, Christ, as identity, stumbles in the night. If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of this world. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbleth, because there is no light in him. He has not accepted that the Spirit of God is his name, identity, and substance. And so the light from within his own being cannot go before him to light the way, to maintain spiritual integrity, to sustain, feed, guide, direct, lead, and inspire. These things said he, and after that he saith unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep. Now to the world Lazarus was dead. But we're learning it's asleep. It's asleep because it's a suspension, a transitional experience. Then said his disciples, taking him very literally, Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well. They think he's in a sense of physical rest. Now, it's not a physical sleep at all. It's a sleep to mortality. He had been asleep to divinity. Now he's sleeping to mortality that he may awaken to divinity. It's not a physical rest. It's a sleeping of the complete mortal sense, which will now awake in an immortal reality. And to clarify this, to point out that there's a difference in death as there is in sleep. Howbeit, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought he had spoken of taking of rest in sleep. And then said Jesus unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Now he could have said to them Lazarus was dead first, but he first said Lazarus is asleep to show us that there's a different kind of sleep he's talking about. And so when he says Lazarus is dead, he means, yes, he's dead if you want to look at it from a human point of view, but I'm telling you, the I within is saying, this isn't death at all. It never has been and never will be. This is sleep. This is the death without dying that every man will learn. And I'm glad that for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent ye may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. Now when Jesus says, I'm glad that I was not there, the I that he means is, I'm glad that the Spirit of God, Christ, was not realized there. That is what makes this physical death, the absence of the awareness of I, Christ, present. Had I, Christ, been present, there would not have been the appearance of the physical death. It would have simply occurred as a visible thing. A man would simply be Christed within. He wouldn't have gone into a death, a languor, a sleep. And you and I, as we realize the Christ, we won't go into this death, this apparent sleep. But it had to be done that way to call attention to it. I'm glad it happened this way, said Jesus, because if I had been there, it wouldn't have. It was my absence that made him go into the sleep. And now, as we return there, I will be present, and you will see the difference. And all of this is the journey within yourself. Because I present in you, there's going to be no Jesus Christ coming to you visibly, but rather the realization of I, Christ, in you awakens us from the sleep of mortality into the awareness of divinity. In the outer symbols of forms, there's distance and space and time. Within yourself is where it all takes place. Nevertheless, let us go unto them. Then said Thomas, which is called Didymus, unto his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Now Thomas means that we may die with Jesus, not with Lazarus. He thinks that just as the stoning of Jesus was attempted before in Judea, it will be attempted again. And this time they'll get Jesus and he'll die. And being loyal, he says, let's go die with him. Now there's a significance there because Thomas stands for sense consciousness. What he sees, he believes. You see, sense consciousness must go and die too. You see the subtlety of what John is telling us? That the Thomas in you must go into Bethany and die there. Sense consciousness must die. The belief in the evidence of the senses must die. Every little detail with surgical skill is included here. Then when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. And so we have the sisters who immediately sent a letter saying he's sick. Quickly thereafter he passed on. Jesus stayed in the stillness for 2 days, received the letter after 2 days of Lazarus' death, and now it was 4 days. Now let's see the 2 and 2 as a meaning there. The first 2 days was the sleeping or the dying to mortality of Lazarus. And then the waiting of 2 days, just as Lazarus in us must die to mortal self, Christ in us must be born. And so 2 days for dying and 2 days for borning. And this is the 4 days. The crucifixion within took 2 days. The crucifixion having reached its peak, now the resurrection within takes the other 2 days. There's a passing out of mortality and a releasing of immortality. And of course there was the old legend in the Hebrew religion that the angel of death carried a sword and there was gall on the end of it, and that by the end of the third night, in the beginning of the 4th day, the soul had passed out of the body. And so Spirit was taking every detail into consideration, and here, although the legend had it that the soul had already passed out of the body, this was going to be shown to be untrue, that there never was a soul in the body to pass out of it. In fact, there never was a physical body there. There was only the Spirit of God present. The Christ is never fooled by the image of body. It is the image of body in Lazarus that is dying in the old consciousness. The new Lazarus will not be living in the body, and he will be conscious of that. He will appear as a body, but he will not be living in a body. Before he passed into the state of sleep, he was not living in a body either, but he didn't know it. He thought he was. And so you and I, going through this experience, will discover that first we think we're in a body, and as we go through the inner crucifixion of the old consciousness, we discover that there is no personal me. Never was. There's no personal body. And when we reach the state of total death to the personal me, and Christ is born, we come forth with the knowledge that I'm not in a body and never was, but now I have a spiritual body. The transition in consciousness reveals the spiritual body of the soul, where before the human mind had known only the material body, which never was there. Christ is now here. 4 days have elapsed. The arrival of Christ signifies that Mary and Martha are becoming aware within themselves of the presence. That the presence is drawing nigh unto the consciousness of Lazarus. The moment of Christing is close. This is still the inner experience that we are all going through, in greater and lesser degrees. Now we have no soul leaving a body. We have the knowledge that no body is there. All that is there is the invisible Christ, plus the sense consciousness which is dying, in which there was the illusion of body, the illusion of human life. And life cannot sustain that old body for one reason. It isn't in the body. The reason the body goes through to death is because there is no life in it. The body being counterfeit, the life that cannot sustain it is equally counterfeit. But there is present a real life. And only when the false is understood and died to does the real life come through. There is no life in form. There is no human life in Lazarus even before the sleep. And he's learning that as Christ comes closer to his consciousness. He's learning as he's in the tomb that I am not in a body of clay. I am not a physical form. I am not a human being. I am not a mortal self. I am going through the first resurrection on this earth since the teaching of Christ Jesus. I am learning that I am immortal self. I am the first fruits of the Christ teaching. I am entering my immortal self, which has ever been present, awaiting recognition. And it is done in a cave, in a tomb, because all Christ's birth takes place in a cave or manger or stable or tomb. The lower self is represented by the tomb, and the lower self must give way to the higher self. So the rebirth is in the cave, in the dark, as the old man dies and the new self is born. The light comes over the horizon of night, and it is day. Day within ourselves, Christ drawing near. And then the mind of us, to describe this inner experience, the mind of us in the outer rushes forth in the form of Martha. The mind rushes forth to greet the Christ, seeing it as a man. The mind cannot perceive the light, so it goes out into the external to greet Jesus. Martha represents the head, the human mind. Mary represents the heart. The head and the heart must be united as one. The faith of the mind is not sufficient. The faith of the heart is necessary. The understanding of the mind is not sufficient. The love of the heart must be kindled. And so Mary and Martha are playing these roles in the initiation of Lazarus, or in the initiation of you, in the initiation of mankind, showing that heart and head, understanding and heart, faith and love must become one. Out of this comes the expression of the divine will. When Lazarus steps out of the tomb, he will be in the divine will. There is nothing he will do after that that is not divine will expressing and sustaining itself. His human will is being released. The divine will is taking its place. And as divine will takes the place of your human will, you will discover yourself reborn of the Christ. It will not happen while human will remains. It must be completely dead. A total extinction of human will. It isn't enough for it to die. It must be buried. Now Bethany was nigh unto Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs off. So we're being told that a couple of miles away is Jerusalem, that this is the path to Jerusalem. You could walk it in about an hour and a half. But spiritually, until you have reached Bethany, where human will is sacrificed to accept divine will totally, you can't move to the higher realm. Unless divine will activates your day, your experience, that is the level at which you will remain in duality, alternating between the good and the evil of the world. But when you have passed to the point where divine will itself is all that you respond to, when you have built the inner ear of response to the will of the Father, when you have accepted yourself as the immortal self, the Spirit, the living child of God, then divine will activates you and moves you up into Jerusalem, 2 furlongs or 15 furlongs away, and these 15 would represent successive states of development that will come after Bethany. New progressions in consciousness, made possible only when divine will is the motivating force of your being. Many of the Jews came in to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Now, if this were outer experience, you can be sure that all of the activity that had followed and many people from the countryside who had gathered would have made it impossible to leave this out of the earlier Gospels. And so we're going to have to see that the Jews who come to comfort are the human thoughts. These human thoughts are not the real comforter. The real comforter is Christ. The human thoughts, the sympathy, the affection expressed, and in this case, the false sense of sympathy, the false sense of affection, because many of these who came are the same ones who wanted to stone the Master, stoning him by turning away from the inner Christ, even bitter toward Christ. And so you can't express love to this one and bitterness to the Christ. You can see the hypocrisy expressed here. And so we're seeing this as the Jews, the thoughts of a person, the thoughts of the human intellect. Try to comfort us, our brother is dying. What good does it do? That doesn't change anything. It just perpetuates the illusion of the death, so that others may go through the same illusion. It obliterates the whole meaning of resurrection. All the flowers and sympathy would represent the Jew, the intellect in us saying to us, don't be feeling so bad about this, all on the mental level, the human level, not seeing the reality that is happening, not knowing that Mary and Martha are going through a learning period. And so while Mary and Martha, seen by John on the inner plane, are entertaining thoughts of comfort about their condition, Martha, as soon as she heard Jesus was coming, went out and met him. It doesn't say out, I put that in. Was coming, went and met him. But Mary sat still in the house. And the reason that I said out is because it's on my mind. Mary did remain in the house. And again the word sat still in the house. Martha ran out. The mind goes out to meet the Christ as a person, but the heart remains within to meet the Christ within the heart. And you're going to see now the beautiful way in which John has traced this for us, how the outer and the inner become one. Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. The mind sees a man. It says, if you, man, if you, Jesus, had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. She's remonstrating. She's saying, in a sense, what took you so long? The mind is personalizing the Christ, but doesn't know it. And of course, Christ must show the error of the mind. So she says now, but I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee. She's still saying the personal power of the man, that he can do something, intercede for Lazarus in some way. But you know, personally he cannot. No human being has any power. Jesus says to her, thy brother shall rise again. He doesn't tell her, you're personalizing, you think I'm a man and that I'm going to do something to help your brother. He doesn't explain to her that his physical presence is not going to do anything, or else he'd have been there long ago. He remained physically unpresent, absent, because it's the Spirit which quickens. And the Spirit is ever present, whether Jesus is physically present or not, and she knows this not. That his physical presence has nothing to do with the ever-presence of the Spirit. That the Christ of Jesus was ever present, though they knew it not. The Christ never left Lazarus, never left Martha, never left Mary, was ever present during the complete activity. But Martha is unaware of this. And rather than explain it, he says, your brother will rise again. How could he be sure? Well, that's what those 2 days were about. Resting in the one Spirit, the one self, until the quickening, the awareness of the presence says, I am the one. Beside me there is no other. And in that assurance, in that inner awareness of the self, there is no death, there is only life expressing. When he says, thy brother will rise again, he's telling her about a fact that already has been established. A fact that could never be otherwise. He's telling her that the life of an individual is always present and does not depend upon the appearance of the form. Your life does not depend upon the condition of your form. You will rise again. Why? Nothing can happen to your life, that's why. The real life is always present. The false life cannot maintain the form. The false form and the false life go hand in hand. And the counterfeit nature of the false life is here revealed, because there is a life that is not counterfeit. and it is present, and it does rise. That rising is not actually a rising, it's the permanent status of that life. It only seems to rise when the false sense disappears. The rising of that life which was ever there is simply the recognition of its presence. The real life, ever present, activates the real body which is ever present. And now we are losing the sense of a counterfeit form and a counterfeit life as the Spirit draws near in the form of Christ Jesus. Thy brother will rise again. You're going to see that life is the name of your brother, that he's always a living soul, that mankind is always invisible life. It doesn't die. It simply tries to live in a form that isn't, and a counterfeit mind cannot maintain a counterfeit form, and it goes through the ins and outs of a counterfeit life, completely oblivious to the real life that is present, which is to be revealed here in a moment. Thy brother will rise again. And of course she can't understand him. Martha saith unto him, Well, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day. Now, she has said something very important. In the resurrection of the last day. If anyone had thought, for example, that the last day meant when you die, you can see that it doesn't mean that at all, because if it meant the last day when you die, then she wouldn't have said he will rise in the resurrection of the last day, because to her sense he's already dead. The last day has already happened. So how can she say he will rise in the last day? The last day has happened. So last day here doesn't mean when Lazarus dies, because he's already dead. It means the end of the world. There will be resurrection in the last day. There will be resurrection at the end of the world. That happens to be a prevailing belief in the world today. And Martha's belief then was wrong and is wrong today. She thought there would be a resurrection in the end of the world, that the world would end and we would all rise into something else, which is so wrong. There wasn't going to be a resurrection at the end of the world. There's going to be a resurrection before the end of the world. There's going to be a resurrection in each individual who comes to Christ. And if we await the resurrection after the end of the world, we simply follow in the path of ignorance which the world has followed up to now, turning away from the message of resurrection while in the flesh. Not in the last day, but in the day before it is night, now. The very thing we're going through. Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believe thou this? Well, it wouldn't really matter what she answered. She could try to believe it because he said it. Martha, the human mind at this point, had no capacity to understand this. I am the resurrection. Think of I in the midst of you, and know that I in the midst of you am the resurrection. I in the midst of you am the life. If you believe on I in the midst of you, though you were dead, yet shall you live. That's precisely what Lazarus was going through. He was realizing I in the midst of him, as shown by Jesus drawing near now to the tomb. He was becoming conscious of I in the midst of him as the resurrection. And if he could speak, he would say, as Jesus drew near to the city of Bethany, as my sister walked out to greet him, I was feeling the presence of I in the midst of me, already beginning to lift me out of the tomb of false belief, out of the tomb of the belief that I had been mortal, into the knowledge that I in the midst of me is the Spirit of God, the resurrection from all false belief, into the reality of walking here now in my Father's kingdom. I in the midst of me, mighty, active, living, opening my eyes to myself. As the Christ reveals, I am the resurrection, you are hearing the inner self say to you, I in the midst of you. I take you through the tomb of mortality. I release the stone that bars the entrance into immortality. I reveal to you my Father's kingdom on earth. I am your only life. The life you had lived in mortal selfhood is not your life. It was the counterfeit. And don't wait for the last day to discover it. Don't wait till the end of a world. Resurrection is now. I am the resurrection, not I will be. Resurrection is this very day. We learn the nowness of resurrection is turning to I in the midst of me, the very self which is the child of God, abiding there. 2 more days until the self is established in consciousness as my reality, till I turn from the mortal sense of self, until Lazarus within me is Christed, until I am the resurrection itself, until I am the life itself, until my secret is that I am no longer under the belief that I am a mortal being. I leave the tomb of mortality. I walk out of the grave, right here on the earth, clothed in a new consciousness. And this is the overcoming of death. Whoever goes through this experience, though he were dead, he shall live. In this overcoming of death, there is no death to go through again. The illusion is shattered. The death is within. We cannot overlook this resurrection of Lazarus for this reason. It is the passport to immortality. It is the very crux, the very crucial moment in the complete teaching of Christ. Without it, there'd be no going into Jerusalem. There'd be no Holy Easter week. There'd be no Palm Sunday. There'd be no rising. There'd be no ascension. There'd be no heaven on earth. With it, there is life without end. And if that is not true, the Bible has no meaning. With it, there is life without end. He has spoken. If you believe on me, though you were dead, yet shall you live. Death has no meaning once I, Christ within, is accepted as the resurrection, a living experience. Not a dead man being raised out of a grave, but one who is asleep to Christ, awakening to Christ. One who is dead to Christ, becoming alive in Christ. This is the crucifixion of mortality, and its component, the resurrection into spiritual self. I in the midst of you is the only place you're going to discover life. And then be still and know that I am God. God in you is the resurrection. God in you is the life. God is not mortal. God is not flesh and blood. God is not living a limited lifespan. Be still and know that I am God. I am the resurrection. I am the life. I can never leave you. I can never forsake you. I am the way. I stand at the door. Open your consciousness to this I in the midst. For I am the resurrection, which you see here as Lazarus. And then Lazarus in you will come forth, reborn of the Spirit. Then Lazarus in the Bible will have a meaning, a living meaning. In every consciousness that accepts the words that are expressed by the Spirit in this particular rendition of John. Some of you may even think right now that you're further into the resurrection experience than you ever dreamed. I think some of you are. You may find that at times you're floating, you're not walking. You're almost aware of the fact that there's a different you here. You may feel a sense of a strangeness in power, an awareness that in some way or other every need is met, quickly, without writing a letter to someone far away, that Christ is present. I am present. I can never leave you. What are you writing a letter to me for? I am present where you are. And so Martha in you is learning to turn within to Mary. That head must come into heart. Faith must be so activated that it turns within to the heart and moves the heart into an activity. That not only faith, but faith must activate the will. It isn't enough to say, I believe. The faith must turn into an active commitment, a living faith. This activates the love. And the love will then rush forth and embrace the Christ and release the divine will. We're going to pause a bit. You'll watch how beautifully John has given us the inner codes that we may move through this experience with knowledge, sure-footed, not groping. Let's just pause in silence a moment. When Christ says to Martha, "Believest thou this?" that is Christ saying to our mind, "Do you believe this?" Martha represents the human mind. And when we can answer as Martha did, it won't be any different than her. She didn't answer with a total conviction. You just don't suddenly change and say, "Oh yes, of course, of course." But she opened herself up to accept, and this was the activization of her faith. She didn't fully comprehend, she didn't have the conviction yet, but there was enough understanding to go and do something about it. And so she saith unto him, "Yea, Lord, I believe thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world." And when she had so said, she went away and called Mary, her sister, secretly, saying, "The Master is come, and calleth for thee." And then mind turns over to heart. The faith now proceeds to the will. Yeah, out here I've said I believe, but now I move into that will and say, now, because I believe, let us do so and so. So Mary comes out. You release your will through your faith. And if your faith isn't strong enough to release your will, then your faith isn't a living faith. And by releasing the will, we mean, this that I believe has reached the depth of consciousness in which I will now do something about what I believe. I might have to change a few things in the outer, in my plans, in my schedule, but I'm going to do something, because now the will of me is going to back up the faith of me. So Martha goes into Mary. You see that code that follows? And now Mary comes out. The will becomes active through faith. And you've met many people who haven't reached that stage. They know all the words, but the will is not following their faith. Mary hasn't come out because Martha is still running around outside. Called Mary her sister secretly, meaning within, saying, "The Master is come and calleth for thee." Now Christ calls those by name whom Christ knows love Christ. You feel the call when there's a love of truth within you. You feel the call of the Christ. Until there is a love of truth within you, you don't feel the call of the Christ. And the Christ cannot call you by name. Only those who love Christ are called by name. Only those who love the child of God within themselves sufficiently to accept are called by name. As soon as she heard that Christ called her, meaning loving Christ supremely, she had opened to the Christ which could say within, "I am come." Outside it was Martha saying to her, but inside it was Christ saying, "I am come." Called by name, she heard the voice. As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came unto him. Arose means spiritually, and quickly obviously is quickened. As soon as the voice spoke within her, she was quickened, risen in consciousness. The outer faith, turning to the inner love, quickens that love into an acceptance of the divine will. And the moment the divine will is quickened in us, we are in the house of the Father. And now everything human is dying and everything divine is being born. Mary rushes out now to greet him. And so physically there's a Mary and there's a Jesus meeting out there. Now Jesus was not yet come into the town, but was in that place where Martha met him. The Jews then, which were with her in that house, incidentally the place that he was in, where Martha met him, is outside of the commotion in the house, outside of the world thought. The Christ never enters into the world thought. We have to leave our consciousness where we are to go to the Christ. We have to leave world thought and go out of world thought. And Mary now leaves world thought. The Jews then, which were with her in the house, again house, sometimes it means the consciousness of truth, sometimes it means world thought. Continued comforting her, and when they saw Mary, that she rose up hastily and went out, followed her, saying, She goeth unto the grave to weep there. Now up to a point, Mary is led by the mind too. But now that she has found the Christ within, the mind follows her. She isn't led by the mind. As she goes out to the grave, the Jew says, let us follow her, because she is weeping and going to the grave. Mind now follows he who is led by the Spirit, whereas before mind leads us, now mind follows us. Soul is taking precedence over mind. Then when Mary was come where Jesus was, she saw him. She fell down at his feet, saying unto him, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. Martha said that too. Do you notice the progression? Martha said it as if to say, why hadn't you come sooner? Mary said the very same words, but she threw herself at his feet. Now she was at a higher level. She was accepting the physical Jesus as a power. But she was accepting him so completely that she was surrendering. And still not in the high consciousness, for she still said, if you had been here, he would have not died. He would not have died. And this is to show us that the absence of I in consciousness is still that which is missing at this point. Until I, the Christ, enter the consciousness of Mary and Martha completely, until they are wedded as one, there is still a separation of believing that if I had been there, he would not have died. Until the realization is, it is not a question if I had been there, the realization must come that I am present. I have never left. I can never leave you. Don't wait for me to come. I am present. She hadn't reached that knowledge. Even though she knew the Christ, she didn't know the fullness of the Christ yet. The fullness of the Christ is the acceptance that I, the Christ, is my own self. All of these separate parts are coming now into a one self, so that I, Christ Jesus, I, Martha, I, Mary, I, Lazarus, will become one I, Christ, in us. No waiting, no separation, no space, no time. Now I, Christ, am here as yourself. Yourself is the resurrection. Yourself accepted. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, He groaned in the spirit and was troubled. The awareness of the distance they still had to travel in consciousness is the groaning. They hadn't learned that his name was Christ. They didn't know he was the activity of God on earth. They still saw him personalized as a man with personal powers. If he had been there, their brother, they didn't understand yet, and that's the groaning. And they were higher than the Jews which followed her. The great gap between the human consciousness and the realization of its own true immortal selfhood is the groaning of spirit. And said, "Where have ye laid him?" Now you would think he's talking about where did they lay Lazarus, the physical form. But it's like pick up thy bed and walk. How are you beholding him in your consciousness? Where have ye laid him? What is your belief? Did you bury him in your consciousness as a mortal being? Are you seeing him as he is? Where have you laid him? What is the level of your consciousness? Where have you laid yourself? What do you believe about you? Wherever your belief is about you, that's where you have laid yourself. Where have you laid him? You may have laid yourself in the tomb of mortality without realizing it. That's the implication. And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." That's the invitation to Christ that all of us must come to. "Lord, come and see" is the invitation. We will look through your eyes. You show us what we should do. She who had surrendered at his feet is now opening to, letting that Christ direct her, show her, be her inner eye. "Lord, come and see where we have laid him. You show us the proper place." The invitation to Christ in your own being. Now Jesus wept. And we should clarify this within ourselves, that wherever a person weeps, we know what that is. When spirit weeps, that is because divine love has not been accepted by immortality. These are infinite tears, purifying with love. These are precious tears. They are telling us that whenever divine love is unaccepted, spirit is weeping. Spirit is saying, the same as it did at the well, "Give me to drink." Christ says, "Give me to drink," meaning Christ in you is thirsty for your recognition. Spirit weeps because spirit is thirsty for your recognition. It's the very same expression. The weeping of spirit, the weeping of Jesus, is the weeping of Christ in you saying, "You've turned away from me. My love is yours and you won't accept it. Why?" These are the tears that are wept within each of us by our own identity, which we are not recognizing. And of course, the human seeing him weep, the human thoughts will say, "Oh, how he loved him." But Jesus is not weeping for Lazarus. Christ is weeping for mankind's recognition. Some of them even said, "Could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should have not have died?" And therefore again Jesus, groaning in himself, cometh to the grave. They wanted to know why, if he could save the blind, he hadn't saved this man from dying. And we must understand that he didn't want to prevent the physical death of Lazarus. What Spirit was going to do was not prevent the death, but restore the life. Preventing the death would be nothing. To reveal the presence of immortal life was the purpose here. And looking out of a material consciousness, we would not know that. Spirit in you is to restore you to immortal life, not to prevent your physical death, but to show you the way to life, not to prolong your physical years, a year or 2 or 10, but to remove the illusion of death completely by bringing us into life before the experience of death. The glorious passport to immortality is awaiting all who hear the weeping of the Christ. And we dry those tears by coming to the Christ, accepting the divine love. Now he comes to the grave. It's a cave. It has a stone over it. A grave, cave, a stone. The grave is the mind. The cave is our obscurity to the truth of the Word. The stone is the appearances that we now put over the cave with our limited knowledge of the letter, so that we've got ourselves totally barricaded out of truth. We bury ourselves in the mind, and it buries us in a body, in a cave. And there we do not know the truth of our own being, and we cover that cave with a stone, the false appearances of the mind, the concepts, the false knowledge that we accept as reality, the false appearances, even quoting the letter of truth and barring ourselves completely from the truth by the false letter of the truth. And he says, remove the stone. Take ye away the stone, Martha. You notice he says it to Martha, the mind. To your mind he says, remove the stone. Remove your beliefs that you know so much in your mind. Remove your effort through your mind. Remove your concepts. Become as Lazarus did. Purify. Free of concept, free of belief, free of any mental activity other than opening through faith, going in to the heart, to the love, to activate that love through faith, to believe, to commit yourself on trust that the love of the Father in you is all you need know. And lo and behold, that will remove the stone. Act of love, trusting love, divine love, to be present in yourself as a living reality. Believing it, knowing it, living it. Roll away the stone. Martha, of course, out of material consciousness, cannot understand. The mind says, but Lord, by this time he stinketh. for he hath been dead 4 days. She still is thinking of a corrupt body. But Christ knows no body to decay. Christ brushes right past that statement. There is no body in there. There is no body out there. There is no mortal decay. That's material consciousness, which is not in the acceptance of self. Said I not unto thee that if thou wouldst believe, thou shouldst see the glory of God? To believe what? To believe Christ within you is present now. Until we believe Christ within me is present now as myself, we're not in the Lazarus consciousness which is ready to be Christed. And when we believe, then they took away the stone from that place where the dead was laid. That's the belief. Active belief is taking away that stone. Christ is my identity. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. The moment you accept Christ's identity, the stone is rolled away, and Christ in you, accepted, which goes to the Father, lifts up its eyes and says to the Father, thank you. I thank thee that thou hast heard me. These aren't words spoken by Jesus. This is the inner consciousness of Christ establishing communion with the Father automatically. And now there's a reciprocal flow. The stone is rolled away. You know your identity. Christ says, and I know that thou hearest me always. God always hears the Christ of you. But because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. And so outwardly Jesus is speaking, but inwardly Christ is merely relaying the words of the Father. You're in grace at this point because Christ in you is always in grace. And when he had thus spoken, he said with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. Now that loud voice, the word loud signifies not human, but infinite. This is the voice of spirit. Lazarus, come forth. The moment you have turned to the acceptance of self, the spirit within you says, Lazarus, come forth. There is a transformation. Lazarus is Christed. This is the second birth. And so it is said that we must have two mothers. First the human, and then the spirit. The second birth. Lazarus, come forth. Come forth into life. The Christing is the coming forth into life, into freedom, into immortality here and now. Remember, this man is going to walk out of the tomb back into the world because it is a now experience on this earth. This is an ascension into the distant, into the ether. He walks back into form for that reason, to show you it must be done now and can be done now on the earth. He that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, his face bound with a napkin. The newborn still carries with him some of the conditioning of the past. The grave clothes represent the thoughts of yesterday. The mind still has its remnants. The face is covered with a napkin. He still can't see. The face represents the perceptive ability. The faculties still aren't completely Christed to the point where he can see the infinite, hear the infinite, live in the kingdom. This is still Bethany. not Jerusalem. But loose him, let him go. The newborn life comes, and with it comes the new freedom, and with that come the new divine gifts. This is the beginning of the life in spirit. For Lazarus, mortality is over. Spiritual life is lived in now. This is the experience of the rebirth that Jesus had taught from the very moment of his mission, beginning of water to wine, transformation. Here it is, Lazarus reborn to the Spirit. Mary and Martha oned in consciousness, as Mary and Martha in you are oned in consciousness. Heart and head become the living act of divine will, moving as the expression of divine love. Loose the Christ within and let him go. So this is the place we come to. And when we come to this place, when Christ Jesus came to this place with Lazarus, it was the beginning of the triumphant entry. Now they would go with their palm leaves, entering Jerusalem. For his hour had now come. The world had been taught that there is a Christ within each of us, a slumbering God. Divinity is revealed where mortality seemed to be. This is the demonstration of it, witnessed by John. Somewhere in the world, the people saw that Lazarus was not dead, and nobody knew what had happened. It may not have been as dramatic as John saw it inside. It probably was nothing much. A man might have been sick and recovered. But if not for John, the world would never have this living gospel about the rebirth that takes place in everyone who comes to the Christ, gives it to drink within, wipes away the tears by reciprocating the love, accepting the love, and then living that love, making divine will the only active ingredient of our complete motivation. Loose him, let him go. Loose the Spirit of God in you, let it go. Let it do its will in you. It is said here that some of the Jews believed and some did not. Many of them came to Mary, and those who had seen the things which Jesus did, some believed, but some went their ways to the Pharisees and told them what things Jesus had done. That means that even after we come to a place where this is somewhat understood, part of the intellect turns one way, part of it turns another way. Part of it goes back to the old consciousness, part of it is uplifted. Sometimes part of it is even offended. It's probably a little too late today to draw conclusions from this, because basically the importance of the resurrection of Lazarus is not that it's reported in the Bible or that the world has walked by it. The only importance of it is, what can we learn from it? What have you learned from it all these years? And what are you learning from it today? And what would you learn from it within yourself? Some of you may be ambitious enough to even want to jot down what you think you've learned from the resurrection of Lazarus. I think it's important enough to make it a written assignment to yourself. I think you'd be very wise to write down to yourself what you have learned from the resurrection of Lazarus up to this moment. If you are further interested in having me look at it, I would be delighted. I would like to know what you have learned from the resurrection of Lazarus. And then I would like to discuss with you what you have learned in the hope that together we could reinforce that. So if you care to, and this is not mandatory, if you want to send to me what you believe you have learned from the resurrection of Lazarus, the fundamental points of it, please do. I'd be very pleased to receive that writing from you. There's no hurry, this week, next week, any time. But I can assure you that next week we will crystallize in this class what we can learn from the resurrection of Lazarus as a living procedure. Because even though we've heard it, putting it all together into a living principle of life is still not easy. For we still must come to the place where we see that Lazarus had learned not to live in a body image, that Christ standing there before the tomb was not in a body image, that Mary and Martha to Christ were not a body image. Are we at that level? Now as you do this, you will discover something beautiful happening to you. You will discover the power of inner vision being formed. You will find that inner vision is opened as you begin to live with the inner vision of John about the resurrection of Lazarus. Our inner vision is forming now. Our inner receptivity to the saints and the sages, our capacity to become aware of the forms of light, our ability to walk to some degree in the invisible without strangeness. All of this comes as you begin to dwell in the inner vision of John. Your consciousness is changing out of materiality into spiritual consciousness. And that is the consciousness in which divine love operates, in which divine will animates, in which the real life activates the real form. Those of you who send me your letters, if you care to make a copy, do so. If you want to write the original and want it back, please put on it, send back to me. If it doesn't say send back to me, I'll just presume that I can make some marks on it, because I'm really going to look into it. And then we're also going to work on resting in oneness, which is the chapter that we're up to in the realization of oneness. I and the Father are one, and that one is called the living Christ where you stand. It's coming together, it's opening us. Let's see if we can't go from Bethany now to Jerusalem. Thanks very much.
I hope you enjoy this spiritual audio. Like, share and subscribe for more.